Pivot table is a great way to analyze and summarize data to find trends and comparisons. They work a little differently depending on what platform you use to run Excel. Organize your data in a tabular format, using an Excel table if possible. This will make it easier to refresh the pivot table cache and include new columns or rows as needed. Keep data types consistent within columns. Mixing dates and text, for example, can cause errors. Remember that pivot tables work on a snapshot of your data, so the cache is separate from your actual data set. To create a recommended pivot table, follow these steps. Number 1. Select a cell in the data range or table. Number 2. Go to Insert, Recommended Pivot Tables. Number 3. Excel will analyze your data and present you with several layout options to choose from. Number 4. Select the pivot table that looks best to you and press OK. Excel will create a pivot table on a new sheet and display the pivot table fields list so you can further customize your results. You can create a pivot table manually by following these steps. Number 1. Select a cell in the data source or table range. Number 2. Go to the Insert tab and click Pivot Table. Number 3. The Create Pivot Table dialog box will appear with your range or table name selected. In this example, we're using a table called Household Expenses. Number 4. Choose where you want the pivot table report to be located by selecting New Worksheet or Existing Worksheet under the Choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed section. If you select Existing Worksheet, choose the cell where you want the pivot table placed. Number 5. Click OK and Excel will create a blank pivot table along with the pivot table fields list. Fields in the pivot table can be rearranged to easily change the appearance of the table. To add a field, check the box next to the field name. The default area for non-numeric fields is the row area, date and time fields go in the column area, and numeric fields are added to the values area. Dragging and dropping an item into any of the pivot table fields is also an option. If there's an item in the pivot table that isn't needed anymore, drag it out of the fields list or uncheck it. Pivot table values. By default, pivot table fields located in the values area will be shown as a sum. However, if Excel interprets your data as text, it will be displayed as a count. That is why it is crucial to make sure you do not mix data types for value fields. You are able to change the default calculation by first clicking on the arrow next to the field name and then select Field Settings option. After that, change the calculation in the Summarize by section. It is important to note that when you alter the calculation method, Excel will automatically generate it in the Custom Name section, like Sum of Field Name. But you have the power to change it. If you click Number button, you can change number format for the entire field. Here are some tips. Once you change the calculation in the Summarize by section, it changes the pivot table field name. So it is advisable to not rename your pivot table fields until you finish setting up your pivot table. A little trick is to click Replace on Edit menu. Find What, then Sum of, then replace with Leave blank. This replaces everything at once rather than having to retype it manually. Instead of summarizing data with a calculation, you can display it as a percentage of a field. The following example uses altered household expense amounts to show as a percentage of the grand total instead of the sum of values. You can make your selections from the Show Data as tab in the Field Settings dialog. It's possible to display a value as both a calculation and percentage by dragging the item into the Values section twice. Right-click the value, select Field Settings, then set the Summarize By and Show Data as options for each one. Pivot tables need to be refreshed when new data is added to the pivot table data source. To refresh just one pivot table, right-click anywhere in its range and select Refresh. If there are multiple pivot tables, first select any cell in any pivot table, go to Pivot Table Analyze on the ribbon, click the arrow under the Refresh button and select Refresh All. To remove a pivot table, select the entire pivot table range and press Delete. This will not affect any other data, pivot tables, or charts around it. If your pivot table is on a separate sheet with no other data you want to keep, deleting that sheet is the best way to remove the pivot table. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys learned something.